Well, as you have probably guessed from the fact that we are in the living room, we're not in the kitchen, that our tidbit tray making project has not come off as planned. And I took a shot of the interior of the schoolhouse. You'll see why. Assuming I could find my tools, I can't get to them. So I either need to get in there and start digging around, or I need to buy some new drill bits. One way or another, we're going to make tidbit trays. We're just not going to do it today. Today, we are going to pick up pretty much on the same theme we left off with yesterday, because there were a lot of comments from people who are interested in a little more information. So today, we are going to talk about what is the difference between antique, vintage, retro, classic. These are the four that we have before us because these are the ones that you have chosen. And if we have time, we are going to go into a little bit about Boho too. So stay tuned. Be right back. Okay, antique. Let's start off with the definition. The definition of antique is anything that's over 100 years old. Now, where we get that definition is from not just a consensus of antiquarians, but a consensus of governments. The U.S. government says anything over 100 years old is an antique. There are other governments that agree with this. So that's the standard, 100 years old. Now, someone had written in the comments on yesterday's video and said, well, I heard antique was now being considered 75 years old. I don't know. Anybody can consider antiques to be, anything they want. 600 years old is an antique. 25 years old is an antique. But that's just their personal opinion. For our purposes, we need to look at what do the experts consider an antique to be, and the consensus in this country is 100 years old, and it's based on the fact that the U.S. government, through the Customs Office, says antiques are 100 years old. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, at one time, that law was differently phrased. And I believe it was in the 30s when they originally promulgated the law. They just put it out in some peculiar way that made it sound like it was only 100 years earlier than that date, the date they enacted the law, which meant that anything after 1835 was not an antique, even when we were right up into the 1960s. They have obviously since changed the law, because I did check, I said I would. The law has been changed. They fixed the boo-boo. And I have an interesting story that I thought you might actually like about another legal boo-boo that I actually participated in the fixing of this boo-boo. In Rhode Island, there was a law that stated that any person who was deaf and was a party as a witness in a trial was entitled to an interpreter free of charge. Great law, right? Well, what if you're a plaintiff or a defendant? Why was it just as a witness? Well, it turns out that when the law was transcribed, and when it was done, it was all done by hand. The person who wrote person who was deaf is a party to a trial as a witness. They meant to write or. They probably actually thought they were writing or, but their handwriting was peculiar and their S's looked like R's, and I actually saw the original transcript And the reason I saw it is because the state handed it over to the Governor's Advisory Council for the Blind. Yeah, I know. It's an issue dealing with the deaf. They handed over to a council dealing with the blind, and we were supposed to decipher somebody's handwriting. Okay. That just, that is classic, like, government in action. So 7 blind people are staring, or pretending to stare as the case may be, at this original transcript saying, what do you suppose he wrote? Meanwhile, somebody's staring at the wall saying, I don't know, it looks like an S to me. Come on, we were blind. Anyway, it was very clear what the intent was. And so the documents got drafted, and in Rhode Island, I don't know how it's done in other states, the lieutenant governor brings forward friendly amendments, and they're pretty much passed without any opposition. And because this is a friendly amendment, it's merely correcting a rather obvious error. So I understand how this sort of thing can happen. You just don't know. Somebody just has a peculiarity of speech, or in the case of the deaf interpreters law, they had a peculiarity in the way they wrote their R's. It was that simple. So anyway, I always thought that was kind of a funny story, especially the part about the blind people deciphering handwriting. Like, oh yeah, we're real good at that. Yep. I can now add to my resume, I am an expert handwriting decipherer. Okay. Since the law has been changed, anything prior to 1919 is an antique. So let's go back and start at the beginning. Because we are in America, we're just going to deal with American antiques, because if we were in Europe, we would have to go back millennia. We're lucky. We only have to go back a couple hundred years. So the earliest settlements, I almost said that, almost came out of my mouth. And my Boricua viewers are never going to forgive me. All right, the earliest settlement in the United States is in San Juan, okay? And that settlement was in the late 1500s. So that's the earliest. In the continental U.S., the earliest settlements were in the early 1600s. That's the beginning of the 17th century. So furniture from that period and the types of furniture you are most likely to see, and you are most likely to see them in New England or Virginia. You're not likely to see them in Illinois or California, would be things like Hitchcock chairs, Windsor chairs especially, trestle tables, gate leg tables. They are still out in people's barns. They can still be found. So those obviously are antiques. Later we are moving into colonial era furniture, mostly the same things: benches, stools, trestle tables, Windsor chairs, Hitchcock chairs. There were some nice pieces, and as the country grew and developed financially, even nicer pieces were being imported from Mother Europe or made here by our own craftsmen. As we move out and move into the 18th century, this is the early 1700s, still in the colonial period, we are getting our own furniture more and more. We're starting to expand our furniture industry. We move into the second half of the 18th century. So this is like 1750 onward. And now you're starting to see things like Chippendale, Hebbel, like Duncan Fife, beautiful stuff. And from our own U.S. workshops that were copying those designs. Chippendale pieces from England are gorgeous, but nothing can touch the ones that came out of Philadelphia and Newport. Those are magnificent. They are just, we took the ball and we ran with it, and we're American. That's what we do. Some of these things are fantastic, and we are going to do a video specifically on some of those early styles of furniture, because they are wonderful. They are still out there. They can still be had. And at this point, we're talking about pieces of furniture that are 250 years old. If you can get them, get them and then take really good care of them. When we go into the early 19th century, now this is the 1800s, and I know a lot of you have trouble with that 19th century means 1800s. I do too. Early 1800s, we're looking at Regency, Empire. The Empire was French, Regency was British. Those styles, particularly in Empire, you get some really exciting stuff like Egyptian revival and Greek revival. They're beautiful, beautiful pieces. And many of those pieces are in the White House. And if you have never seen Jackie Kennedy's tour of the White House, you really have to see it. And if you can't get your hands on a copy of that, one of these days I will start posting segments in the videos. That you need to see it. It's just incredible because culturally, this is our heritage. And Jackie Kennedy did so much work to preserve it for us. And she was like my personal idol as a child. I wanted to grow up and be her. Didn't work out that way. Anyway, beautiful stuff. A lot of great styles. And then we move into the mid 19th century. This is the Victorian era. Victorian furniture, I mentioned John Belter. He was the height of Victorian. When you say high Victorian, Belter you're talking about. Beautiful, heavily carved rosewood. He had a laminating technique. That's what he was known for. He could just laminate pieces of wood and create great curves, just beautiful stuff. But this is also the Gothic Revival period. This is also where the arts and crafts movement got its impetus. Art Nouveau started coming out of this period. The high points of Art Nouveau were later on. Eastlake as well came out of Gothic Revival. There was a sort of continuum. And by the time you hit 1880, you're looking at Mission. You're looking at arts and crafts, Art Nouveau, Eastlake. And it was just the start of Art Nouveau. It was sort of the end of Eastlake. When you get to the turn of the century, Mission Oak, Grand Rapids furniture, all of this stuff going right up until we hit just about 1920. It takes us straight through the end of the First World War. Those are all antiques. Deco, not yet. It will be soon. Not yet. Now, once we get past that, we're talking about vintage. Now, the definition of vintage classically has been 50 years old. 50. Recently, people are saying, no, it's 20, it's 25, it's 30. We know Etsy calls it 20, but the standard definition is 50. And that's important to keep in mind because usually when you get something that's newer than 50 years old, it's not being treated with the same reverence, i.e. high price tag, as something that's more than 50 years old. So it's important for us to know the difference. So when we get into 20th century furniture, and we start off with what I call mid-century traditional. And this is the period that sort of came in after Art Deco, the Great Depression. Furniture became more traditional. The reason for this, of course, is we'd just come out of a war. The economy was shattered. And in situations like that, I suppose it's just human nature to look for stability and solidity. That's what people were looking for. So the furniture of the late 40s and going into the early 50s was very traditional. And usually when we say traditional, this is what we're talking about. And if you want to know what it is, go take a look at old 1950s sitcom reruns. You look at Leave It to Beaver's living room. You look at the living room on Father Knows Best. Yes, These shows were filmed in the 1950s, but of course Hollywood was always 10 years behind the times. But they were using that sort of mid-century traditional. From there, we move into mid-century modern. And mid-century modern, there are a lot of aspects to it. And because it's closer to our time, that's something I'm going to pull aside for another video to go through mid-century modern in more detail. But when we talk about mid-century modern, the things that come to our minds is the economic post-World War II boom, when suddenly everybody had everything. Everybody owned a house, 2 cars in every garage, a chicken in every pot. Actually, I think that was Wilson, who was a little before then. But yeah, the American dream was coming true. We have mass consumerism, and we have mass production, and you could really get lots of goodies. And it was everything from very traditional sorts of furniture right through the Sputnik-y Ames atomic stuff, the glitzy mid-century modern stuff that we think of when we say mid-century modern. So from there, we move into the 60s and 70s, which is very different. You never know what era you live in when you live in it. The people of the Middle Ages did not think they lived in the Middle Ages because they couldn't wrap their heads around a future age. You know, they thought they were living in modern times, and it's that way. People living in the mid-century didn't think of themselves as living in the mid-century. They thought of themselves as living in the modern era. So as we get closer to our own time, the styles haven't really been set yet. And we could find a generation from now, they are referring to us in ways we never imagined. They are identifying us by things we never thought would resonate with them. So when we get into the 60s and we start looking at 60s decor, we start looking at lava lamps and hanging macrame for planters and those big wicker king chairs. And that was 60s, moving into 70s. Beanbag furniture. Furniture shaped like hands. Yes, I remember those. We move into the 70s, more of the same, but it started toning down a little. Once we got into the 80s, boy, we had rejected all of that. Everything was like sand and beige. So the orange and avocado greens of the 60s and 70s were just totally out. Everything was bland. It was neutral. It was what they were calling earth tones. So sand, beige, taupe, boy, we were bland people back then. 90s started to move out of that. And in the 90s, we started to see some interesting things. In the 90s, we started seeing a lot of imports coming in. Now, we'd always seen imports coming in before, but they weren't usually part of your average home. When you went into somebody's house, you didn't expect to see a Chinese lamp or an Indian side table. In the 90s, those things started becoming popular, and the import stores really made them accessible. When we got into the 21st century, we're looking at things like Shabby Chic and Paris Apartment and Boho and all these other cutesy things, which is probably just a way of saying we got stuff that's broken and old. But that's okay. As I say, we won't know. It's our grandchildren that will define us, not us. So when we talk about vintage, we are talking about items from the antique, the end of the antique period, which right now is 1919, moving up through, if we use the most generous definition of vintage, which is 20 years, it's moving right up to the 21st century. All those things would be vintage. Some things that are indisputably vintage would be mid-century traditional, mid-century modern, and Art Deco. It's indisputable. Anybody's definition of vintage will include them. So, done antiques, done vintage. Now let's talk about retro. Retro is a term that is widely abused. People look at that and say, oh, that's so retro, meaning it's old. That's not actually what retro means. What retro means is something that is new, but designed to look old. So I know most of you watch the Crazy Lamp Lady videos, and Joss and I go into the thrift store, and she grabs a lamp and says, oh, mid-century modern, picks it up, looks at the bottom and says, oh, TJ Maxx. And I know she's said this on camera. She certainly said it to me privately many times. What happens in 10 years when those TJ Maxx tags come off the bottom and people are not quite so discerning, and those things are starting to be taken as mid-century modern, when in fact they're 60, 70 years newer than mid-century modern. But those lamps, those mid-century modern looking lamps that came from TJ Maxx or Target, that is retro. Retro is something that simply looks old. And you see this all the time. You could go on Amazon and say, I want to get a vintage looking transistor radio. You buy them. I got one as a gift not too long ago for someone. I think it was lime green. Retro radio. But that's what it is. That's what retro is. So you can use retro casually in conversation, but if you actually use it to, for example, describe a resale listing, be careful, because your buyer, your potential buyer, who may not be your buyer after all, may look at retro and say, is this really an old piece, or is this a modern piece made to look old? Because to me, that's my definition of what retro is, and your buyer would be correct. So use retro carefully. If you're going to describe something as, oh, has a wonderful retro look, just make sure you specify how old it actually is, because retro is about a look, not about an age. Just remember that. Look, not age. Okay? So that's retro. The other definition we were asked to look at was classic. And that's an interesting one. What happens when you say something is classic Art Deco or classic mid-century modern? I've got a piece I want to show you because this is classic. There you go. Now you can see us both. Okay, classic mid-century modern. Why am I calling it that? Because it has the atomic starburst design, and it's in the perfect mid-century color of mustard. This is a 12-inch round platter, so you've got your nice, large mid-century serving piece. Remember, entertaining was a big deal in the mid-century. There are a lot of theories on that, and feminists and women's studies people will tell you that the reason there was so much entertaining in the 1950s is because when the boys came home from war and Rosie the Riveter had to leave the factories, there was a concerted effort to get her into gourmet cooking and entertaining at home, because, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, so to speak? And society had an interest in getting the women back out of the factory now that they were no longer needed, and the boys came back and needed the jobs. So, feminists don't like that period. Classic, mid-century modern. So what do I mean when I say that? In this sense, classic means typical, even archetypical, that this is a piece we can use to teach from because it embodies the style. It has everything we need that period to have. So if you say a piece is classic 50s, It needs the 50s lines. It needs the 50s colors. Wouldn't be bad if it had a little bit of the 50s backstory, like a large serving platter. It's representative. So classic, like retro, doesn't refer to an age. It rather refers to the characteristics of the piece. How well does it reflect the age it comes from? And if it reflects it very well, classic. So there we go. Now, I said if we had some time, we'd go through Bohemian and Boho, because we got a question about that. And one of our viewers had written in and said, is Bohemian just clothing? Is it style? What is Bohemian? Or Boho is what she was saying. So in order to say what Boho is, we've got to go back and decide what Bohemian is. And Bohemian, if you look it up in the dictionary, you're going to find that it refers to the people of the Czech Republic. Bohemia was an area of the Czech Republic back in the days when it was Czechoslovakia. And so you're going to wonder about this connection. I know I did, so I took it a few steps further, and I actually dug into that connection. What in the world do the Czechs have to do with the early Bohemians who were artists and musicians and poets and starving and living in garrets, and they were transients? Well, there is a connection, and the connection is our friends, the French. And now remember my motto, the French are not like the rest of us. I'm going to get that tattooed on me somewhere. The French are not like the rest of us. Back in the early 1800s, this is the beginning of the 19th century, there were collective groups of starving writers and artists, and they were strange and different. They were like Lord Byron and Percy running off to sail around in Italy and write their works, but Byron and Percy had enough money. Byron and Percy Shelley. I'm sorry. That was rude of me to call him by his first name. I don't even know him. All right. Byron and Shelley. They had money. They could just go live in a rented villa all summer and, drink absinthe and write bizarre poetry. Not everyone did, but this is the era. And think Byron and Shelley. Groups of artists, poets, writers, dancers, musicians, all of the fine arts types, for some reason flocked to Paris. And you never know why that happens. Maybe one went, others followed, but it happened. And they lived in very poor sections of town because they were starving artists. They weren't like Byron and Shelley. They didn't have fortunes to draw. And they were itinerant. They came and went, just moved. They weren't really tied down to any one place. So they moved into communities initially that were primarily occupied by Romany people, who are gypsies. Well, that's who I guess were later known as gypsies, the Romanies. And that combined with two other factors. One, these people had an itinerant lifestyle, and the Romani were known as itinerant gypsies, created a certain amount of confusion. And then you have the French, who are notoriously xenophobic. And xenophobic, that'll be our word of the day. Xenophobia means a fear of strangers. It comes from the Greek, xenos, which is stranger, and phobia, which is fear. Boy, that is classically French. Well, the French saw these groups of artists living in communities with the Romani gypsies and said, oh, they are all gypsies. But because they were French and xenophobic, they were not very clear on the difference between the Romanis and the Bohemians of Czechoslovakia, So they said they were all Bohemians. Like I said, they're not like the rest of us. It's the French who can explain them. So that's how they came to be called Bohemians, a French mistake based on xenophobia. And these artists and writers, by the time you're like 20 years into the movement, it's reading like a who's who of the great literary and artistic minds of the day. Um, the people who were involved in this were just outstanding. I mean, everyone from Mark Twain in the United States, like right up to Hemingway, and then you would have Henry Miller, Aeneas Nin, modern people. It just became this wonderful subculture that was incredibly artistically productive, but they were all just impoverished, living on a shoestring in garrets and moving every 2 months, one step ahead of the landlord trying to collect the rent. That's where Bohemian comes from. And that's where Boho comes from. Because Boho came around, they say the style really arrived around the turn of the 21st century. But in fact, it, I can remember touches of that as early as the 80s with the long dirndl skirts and the oversized sweaters and that sort of post-hippie look. And that's where the boho look came from. Boho is just short for bohemian. And so when you think about it, if you look at people who have that sort of boho look, adopt that style, they tend to look very artsy and creative. That's a look they're striving for. And the question I was asked was, does this translate to anything other than clothing, other than a personal fashion statement? And the thing is, it kind of does, um, because many decorative styles that we often thought of in the past as, oh, it's Paris apartment, oh, it's shabby chic, now we're getting lumped in as boho. And it basically has come to just mean eclectic and with a look of having been bought at a secondhand store. So there is my 50 cents worth of Bohemian and Boho as well. That's something that because we are in the middle of this, we're not going to know how it's going to sift out. My money is on the fact that boho will eventually become the term that takes over for Paris apartment and shabby chic, simply because boho is a lot quicker and easier to say and write. And it is the tastemakers who are going to label us. And I think they are going to call our artsy fringe boho in years to come. So we'll see if I'm right. Okay, coming up, I want to show you some pictures of Renee Stathen's sister Nancy with her flatware. Renee had sent an email that just left me and Lisa both in tears because Nancy is so pleased with the flatware. She can actually use it in comfort. So, Nancy, flatware. Okay. And the other picture I promised you, which is the interior of the schoolhouse, which is why your project video is going to have to be delayed. Okay, yeah. It's going to be a lot of cleanup work. Finally, one more giveaway. This necklace, another one of Lisa's pieces. I'm going to show you a picture of this, a close-up, right here. New giveaway. Again, 1-day giveaway. Going to choose the winner at the end of the day. Going to go out tomorrow. All you have to do is write in and say, give me that other necklace, and it's yours. We just pick a winner at random. Same thing as yesterday. Yesterday's winner, we will be announcing in the notes below. Okay? So if you entered, look for your name in the notes below, and of course, I'll respond to the comment you placed. Same thing for this one. Leave your comment. I will respond in the comment. So it'll just come up as a reply from me. And then next video, your name will be underneath in case I missed you this time. So have a fantastic week, everybody, and I'll see you next time.